Models of generosity. All local communities of faith are to be models of generosity to other churches. Here's Gene.
As we've seen in this letter, the Apostle Paul met Titus, probably in Philippi, in Macedonia, and Titus gave him a good report and said, Paul, they followed through on the instructions in that painful letter. But there's an issue that they're not following up on. And, of course, Paul and Titus had a discussion about the fact that when he had been there on the first journey and established the church, he was there for actually a year and a half before he left, and he had given some instructions. In fact, in the letter that he wrote to them, the first letter, it's called 1 Corinthians, the one we have in our Bible. It wasn't the first letter he wrote to Corinthians, but the first one we have in the Bible. He gave them some specific instructions regarding generosity, and this is what we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Now about the collection for the saints. Do the same as I instructed the Galatian churches. Now, just to give you a little review, the Galatian churches were the churches that were founded by Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey. You remember he went to Pisidia, Antioch. That's not Antioch of Syria, but Pisidia, Antioch. From there, he went to Iconium, went to Lystra, went to Derbe, then returned and established those churches and appointed leaders. But he had revisited these churches probably on his way on the third missionary journey before he settled in Ephesus for those 3 years. And so he says, now about the collection for the saints. Corinthians, do the same as I instructed the Galatian churches. On the first day of the week, each of you is to set something aside and save in keeping with how he is prospering, so that no collections will need to be made when I come. Now, the background here is that there was a famine that hit the Jerusalem, Judea area, and the believing Jews were really under incredible pressure because there was plenty of money in the coffers in Jerusalem, but they did not have access to it, and it was as if they were cut off from what we would call Social Security or any help from the government or from other sources because they were believers. And so it affected these believers in an unbelievable way in terms of their needs. So Paul was determined to collect money from the Gentile churches to take to Jerusalem ultimately to help meet their needs. So he's referring to this here in this first letter in terms of how to raise that money. And to encourage the Corinthians, he actually refers to the Macedonian churches. Now remember, he's in Macedonia, probably in Philippi, as he's writing this letter. And so when he got into Macedonia, and remember there was some persecution involved there, he referred to that, but also they were in desperate straits in terms of need, physical need. Now, these churches were the Philippians, the Bereans, the Thessalonians. Those were all the Macedonian churches. We're not sure what happened, but evidently in Achaia, that's down much further south, the Corinthians were probably doing okay. But the Christians in Macedonia were having a really tough time. So he uses these churches as a wonderful example of generosity. It's unbelievable, really. He says this, we want you to know, Corinthians, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that was given to the churches of Macedonia. Those Philippian believers, those Berean believers, those Thessalonian believers. During a severe trial brought about by affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. We don't know what happened, but whatever happened affected them economically. Maybe it was a part of the persecution. We're not sure. But he says this, I can testify that according to their ability, which wasn't much, and even beyond their ability, of their own accord, They begged us earnestly for the privilege of sharing the ministry to the saints, and not just as we had hoped. Instead, they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us by God's will. And I read that passage, there's no way I could identify with that. I've never been in poverty. And to give out of poverty. And to do it with a heart of love for those who are in need. It's an incredible, incredible example. And so Paul shares this example in relationship to what these believers were doing. Now, most importantly, the one line that I want you to notice is they gave themselves first to the Lord. And that's a really key statement. Why were they generous? Because they gave themselves first to the Lord. And to me, there's a real correlation there. See, it follows naturally when we really give ourselves to the Lord, when we really want to follow Him, when we really appreciate all He's done. We become generous Christians with what we have. What we have. And that's how God measures. With the Macedonian believers, they didn't almost have anything. But they gave. And that's an incredible example. More specifically, God is asking all churches, I believe, with this illustration, to model generosity and evaluate their own giving patterns in the light of other churches who are generous. We all need those models. And Paul gives us a marvelous example of this model for the Corinthians, encouraging them to follow through on what they said they were going to do when he had been with them before. Here's a reflection and response question, and that is, why is it that Christians who have little of this world's goods are often willing to be more generous than Christians who have abundance? That's a question to really think about. And as I was reflecting on that question, I can think of people that have had very little. I can think of widows or women who are alone from their families or with their family, but for one reason or other, they're in a difficult situation. And I remember one situation, which is reflective of several over the years, and very regularly, this widow lady sent a check to our ministry. But I also knew that she was giving regularly to the church. And I also knew she didn't have very much. And I thought about that. And the fact is, in God's sight, she was far more generous than any one of us, probably, including yours truly, in God's scheme of things. Because she was giving out of her little. But she was giving, and it was generous and probably sacrificial. But why is it that those who have little sometimes are more generous proportionally than those who have more? And I think that's part of our culture, really. I think it's really a part of our culture, and there's an interesting pattern, and that is, it seems that the more we have, generally speaking, if we're not careful, the more we keep for ourselves. It just happens. You know, I was illustrating that in my own mind, that if I receive $100 to give $10, that's pretty comfortable. But what if I have 1,000, then I give 100? Little interesting, huh? What about 10,000 and I give 1,000? If indeed, let's say I'm giving 10%, which my wife and I have always tried to do. But all of a sudden, that 1,000 seems pretty big, right? Well, what about 100,000 and 10,000? Whoa. That's a big number. But the big number is in our mind in terms of our giving, not what we're taking in. What about 200? And now, if we just give 10%, it'd be 20,000. You see, the interesting thing is that there's a pattern that the more people make, generally, not true of all Christians, the less they give, percentage-wise, in relationship to what they once gave. And it should go the other way. because the New Testament teaches proportional giving. And let's say that the minimum we give, let's say to start, is 10%. And then, as God blesses, it should go up percentage-wise, which means those numbers that we give even get greater in terms of what we take in. Now, what I'm sharing with you is a fact, that this happens in our culture. And I think the lesson for every one of us is simply not to allow materialism to penetrate our lives. That's a very important principle. And we need models. And so Paul gives us a model. He gave the Corinthians a model. So here's the principle to live by. All local communities of faith are to be models of generosity to other churches.